am Donna Mullins, president of the Lansing Area League of Women Voters. In response to a glut of misinformation about schools and diversity, critical racial thinking, all this stuff, the Education Committee has invited an expert in the subject. And we're very grateful for their work, and that Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews will be our speaker. She knows what she's talking about. People vote on issues, and education looms as an important issue for families, as it does for the rest of us. Once again, thanks to dedicated members, we'll be better able to understand today's news items. We want you to be able to ask questions using the Q&A, and that'll be moderated by Judy Andre and Betty Menchek, and we'll be able to ask questions to our speaker that way. Today's program will be moderated by Pat Quinn, now retired. Pat worked as an attorney with the Michigan Attorney General's office, and she's also a former educator, and she's a current member. She's also fun to be with when you're registering high school students. We can't wait for those days to come back. Here's Pat.
Hello. We are very happy to have as our speaker today, Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews. She is the chairperson and a professor at MSU's Department of Education. She earned her education doctorate at Harvard University. And at MSU, she's a professor of race, culture, and equity. Her research is broadly focused on racial justice and educational equity. She examines issues of racial justice in preschool through 12 learning contexts and on college campuses, in urban teacher preparation and identity development, and critical race praxis with K through 12 educators. Dr. Carter Andrews' scholarship examines these issues by illuminating voices of youth and adults who've been historically and traditionally marginalized in schools and society. Dr. Carter Andrews is a 2019 recipient of the Division G Outstanding Mentoring Award from the American Educational Research Association. She's also co-editor of the Journal of Teacher Education. She's given 2 TED Talks, The Conscious Gap in Education and Teach Kids to Be Eagles. Her work has been published. Oops. It's been published. Where's it been published? It's been published in several top-tier academic journals and media outlets. I want to remind you before we bring Dr. Carter Andrews on, I want to remind you to put your questions in the Q&A, as we go along, as she's speaking, and we'll have an opportunity for them to be answered after Dr. Carter Andrews has finished speaking, and Dr. Carter Andrews.
Thank you so much, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone. It is just so wonderful to be with you today. It is just a privilege and an honor to be able to come and have this opportunity to be in dialogue and community with you virtually. I just want to thank the Lansing Area League of Women Voters for inviting me. And I just look forward to the conversation after I've shared a bit of information with you that helps to raise your awareness and knowledge around topics, but also facts and issues so that you can make informed decisions and also educate those in your own circles and spheres of influence. So I will talk for about 30, maybe 40 minutes on the broad topic that you see here in the title, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And as Pat said, please, I welcome your questions. We may or may not get to all of them, but we will do the best that we can. So the broad topic is a discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Michigan schools. What is being taught? And I'll talk a little bit about that as I frame my comments around critical race theory, which is the topic of the day. It has been for over a year. I want to both bring facts and also dispel myths about what the theory is and what's actually happening in Michigan schools by way of influence of CRT. I will use CRT for short, which is commonplace in regular discourse and academic discourse. And then I was also asked to help the group think about what are ways that parents, grandparents can really be educating young people on race, because it is a topic that we need to talk about. But how do we do that in critically conscious ways, loving ways, even though loving ways can be challenging and also move us to reflect on positions and attitudes that we need to change, and some tips for you on that. So I will talk about that as well. And I'll also share a little bit about SB 460, which is the bill that is in the Michigan legislature around CRT. So let's go right ahead and get started. I want to start by just saying, why does teaching youth and adolescents about race matter, right? Why should this even matter? And I'll just offer up a couple of points for you around that. For one, race is a social identity marker that is part of the fabric of our society. And I want to be clear that I'm talking today primarily in a US context. Race and the ideas around race primarily are Western ideas that have now had global impact. But for many of you who may travel abroad, if you go to some countries and use some of the race terms that we use here in the US, people will look at you funny because in their native land, they don't use the same language that we do. And the concept of race is not constructed or utilized in the same way. And so with that, it's important, especially in our schools, to be thinking about why we need to talk about race, because our schools are so ethnically diverse now. And you have students coming from other countries learning from students who are domestic, and those students from other countries don't become part of a race group until they enter the US. And that's a whole new phenomenon for them. Also, young people grow up in a racialized society, and they need to understand their own lived experiences as racialized experiences, right? Now, it's not just race in a vacuum. So there are intersecting identity markers that young people have to think about. So for example, what does it mean for a young person to live in our society both as a Black person, but perhaps a Black girl who is Muslim, right? So those intersections matter, as well as how people might perceive that Black Muslim girl as Black. So I want you to be thinking about race, why it's important to talk to young people about race, and also race as it intersects with their other identities, and then how they're treated, how people treat them based on that. And then the last thing I want to say is young people do need to understand there is a racial hierarchy that exists in the US. And we don't have time to talk about how that hierarchy was when it was constructed, but early in the 15th century. But this is the truth. We don't have race without racism, because race exists within a hierarchy where whites are at the top and various people of color groups are stratified in the hierarchy. And so all of our young people, those that identify as white and those that identify as people of color, need to understand the racial hierarchy and the implications of it for their everyday life. And you'll see here that I say we really have to help young people develop skills to advocate for racial equality and equity. Why? Because we don't have that right now, okay? In any sector of our society, education, healthcare, government, criminal justice, housing. And so these young people that are being educated in Michigan schools, they are our future. They are our tomorrow. And they need to be skilled in how to advocate for social justice and racial equity and justice. So let's move to thinking about what is critical race theory, right? What is this? And because I'm an academic, I have broken this down into layman's terms, right, as much as possible to just make it easy to digest. But in simple terms, it is a theory. It is a theoretical framework, and it's also a field of intellectual inquiry that really demonstrates the legal codification of racism in the US. And what do I mean by that? That CRT really began in the study of law, okay? It did not start in education. Kimberly Crenshaw really coined the term critical race theory. She is a law professor, a legal scholar who was part of the movement in the late 60s and 70s around civil rights, who began to think about how racial oppression has shaped and continues to shape the legal fabric of the United States. This is where it began, okay? Now, I will tell you, the theory moved into the discipline of education in colleges and universities in 1995. So you should understand that in education as a discipline, we haven't even been using this framework for 30 years. Some would call it still yet a baby or evolving in how we use the frame to analyze racial inequity in education. One thing you should know is that CRT is less concerned with like the individual acts of racism between people. It is really a framework and a tool that helps us analyze how racism is codified in the law through institutions, policies, and systems. So we take education as an example. Education is an institution in the United States. We can use this framework, and we do, to analyze patterns of racial injustice within education. And that's what people in colleges and universities do with CRT. And then they utilize their analyses to help K-12 educators then make better informed decisions about curriculum, programming, and just everyday practice. Now, what does CRT claim, right? It is a framework and it does have some claims. So I want to talk to you about what it does claim and what it does not claim. It does say that race is a social construct. It's not a matter of biology. I am on the side of that. I agree with that. There is scientific evidence that indicates we are more alike biologically than we are different. Race as a construct is really rooted in differences in phenotype and physical characteristics. By phenotype, I mean skin color, right? And so in that way, it's a social construct. It's not a matter of biology. And the theory also claims that. The theory also says racism is endemic to US society, that it's a persistent part of the fabric of American life. And this makes a lot of people angry, just flat out angry. What do you mean racism is just part of the fabric of American life? Well, the theory says if you go all the way back to this nation's founding, racism has existed. Actually, before 1776, which is when we became a unified nation, right? Not just some colonies in some areas, racism existed. Why? Because slavery as an economic endeavor, building our economic system on the backs of literal human beings who were seen as property, that is an institution of racism. So this is what the theory means by racism is a part of the fabric of American life. It's not a nice history, but it's a true history that we cannot ignore. Thirdly, the theory claims that the voices and experiences of people of color ought to be legitimate parts of the historical and contemporary. I don't want you to just get caught up in the historical narrative of US and American life, but the narrative now, right? And it should inform institutional decision-making and policy development. So we often understand the history of the US through the eyes and perspectives of white people. That is a fact. And the experiences of people of color are even told from the lens of white Americans. CRT says and has said we have to stop that. We also have to hold up the lived experiences of people of color from their voice. Let them tell their own stories and let those stories be part of what college students learn, K-12 students learn, and what decision makers understand so that they develop policy and programs that are really inclusive and equitable, right? That's what CRT is also saying. And lastly, CRT claims all efforts should be made to work towards social justice and equity, where racial equity and justice are central to the agenda. Part of that argument is because racism, the theory says racism is a part of the fabric of American life. So any social justice project in this country, whether it's about women, whether it's about LGBTQIA plus people, whether it's about the elderly, whether it's about incarcerated folks, has to have race as a central part of the agenda. Because the theory would claim you can't fight for justice for any of those groups if you are not also thinking about how the injustice that they experience is racialized. That's what the theory would claim. What CRT is not is this. Okay, CRT does not claim these things that you see here, even though they're being purported in the national discourse. The theory never says that one race or sex is inherently superior to another. It never has claimed that. It has never claimed that an individual by virtue of their race or sex is inherently privileged or racist or sexist or oppressive. What the theory does say is that there is a system of racial hierarchy where whites are at the top. Thus, whites benefit in all systems of our society by way of the original construction of the racial hierarchy. It's just a fact, right? And so that privilege or benefit, you didn't ask for it if you're a person that identifies as white, but you have to understand how that automatic privilege or advantage may be operating in a systematic way to disadvantage people of color. And so then there's an accountability to say, I can't get rid of my privilege, but I can make sure it's not operating in my daily life or in systems in ways that oppress other people. The theory also doesn't claim that an individual's moral character is determined by their race or sex. It doesn't say that. And it doesn't say that by virtue of your race or sex, you bear responsibility for the actions of your ancestors. None of us are responsible for the actions of our ancestors in any racial or sex group. However, we are responsible for what we do with the privilege that their actions historically have given us. And if we continue to live a life in a way that privilege oppresses other people, that's what we're responsible for. Lastly, the theory doesn't claim that an individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any of these other things. It doesn't claim that you should, but once you begin discussing race and racism with people across culturally diverse groups, you might feel discomfort, guilt, shame, embarrassment. Those are natural feelings, especially if your own identity mirrors that of ancestors who participated in horrific acts of oppression. So those are natural feelings, but there's no framework that says you should feel that way. And furthermore, if teachers, right, I don't know of a teacher who does this, but if a teacher is telling kids they should feel that way, that's awful and should not happen. So I'm going to pause now and show a video clip from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, as I said, the woman who coined the term critical race theory. And then we'll move on, because I think it's important for you to hear from her words how she explains the theory. And so I'm going to stop this share and move over to YouTube.
Joining me now is Kimberly Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum and the legal scholar who coined the term critical race theory. So it is your fault, madame. I tripped over the curb this morning and I went, critical race theory? Damn you! You tripped me on it does everything bad. And the cicadas, y'all really need to stop with the cicadas critical race theory. That was not nice.
We can throw everything in the bag, everything in the bag.
So I just wrote down a few of the notes of what people are calling critical race theory. Marxism, racism, bigoted. Let's start with the Marxism. That's their favorite one. They're using that every single time. And I hate to ask dumb questions, so please don't think that I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They are stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than for on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
So is critical race theory, is there a K through 12 curriculum that right now is being taught? I'm sorry, I know it's a dumb question, but is there a K through 12 curriculum on critical race theory that's being taught in schools around this country?
Well, look, Joy, if it was news to most Americans that critical race theory was in K through 12, it was news to me too. I'm one of the co-authors of one of the few books on critical race theory. I think I would know if we were being taught in K through 12. I mean, basically, critical race theory, classic critical race theory is a law school course. And it's really, not taught as widely as I would hope it would. Yeah. But here's the deal. This is not about whether anything called critical race theory is in K through 12. What they're calling critical race theory doesn't exist anyway. It is a backlash effort to reverse the racial reckoning unlike any we've seen in our lifetime. And as you pointed out at the beginning, they can't say, we're for racism. They can't say Derek Chauvin should have killed George Floyd with his hand in his pocket, looking like he was completely without a care in the world. They couldn't say that. So they looked around and found a strange sounding theory that they could put all of the grievances and resentments in and mobilize people around.
So you hear there from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the founder, around what CRT was intended to be, and now the ways in which it may be being used politically, really misused and abused. And we can talk more about that as you desire when we get to Q&A. Didn't mean to go to the beginning, so let's fast forward. So now that I have talked to you about what CRT is, what it does claim, what it does not claim, and then you've heard from the woman who coined it, I want to talk about what you should know about SB 460 that's in the Michigan legislation. And you'll see there that you can find the bill online. I put the link at the bottom of the screen, but you can Google to find SB 460. I wanted to share with you, in case you're unfamiliar, it was introduced by particular senators on May 20th of last year, and it was referred to the Committee on Education and Career Readiness. I just want you to see what is said in the bill in part, right? Because I just told you what CRT is and what it is not. So I'll read this for various modalities for folks. The people of the state of Michigan enact Section 1167, notwithstanding any other provision of law under this act to the contrary, beginning with the 2021-2022 school year, that's right now, and this is for K-12, the board of a school district or the board of directors of a public school academy shall ensure that the curriculum provided to all pupils enrolled in the district or academy does not include coverage of the critical race theory, the 1619 Project, or any of the following anti-American and racist theories. Now, I want you to see what these ABCDE say, because I just told you this is not what CRT claims. A, that any race is inherently superior or inferior to any other race. B, that the United States is a fundamentally racist country. CRT does claim that. C, that the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution are fundamentally racist documents. D, that an individual's moral character or or worth is determined by his or her race. And E, that an individual by virtue of his or her race is inherently racist or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. Now, when you have time, I want you to sit with that A, B, C, D, and E with your newfound understanding or deepened understanding of the theory itself. If one believes that racism is a part of the American fabric, some of these things you would then deduce to say, well, that's true, right? But there are other things here that the theory nor the 1619 Project inherently claim. So now let's segue from thinking about here's what CRT is, here's what it's not, here's what I need to know about legislation that's sitting currently in Michigan, to how can I talk to my kids or my grandkids about race? So I want to run through these, and I've given you a couple of books. You might want to order them. You may be familiar with Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, for adults. It's a very thick book, and I didn't think to bring mine to this session to just hold up for you. But he and Jason Reynolds adapted a kid's version, both for young kids and for middle schoolers. I would recommend this book for you as the kids can read it, you can read with them, and you all have discussions, right? So one tip is to start early. It's okay to talk about skin color with kids. There is research that shows by 6 months of age, babies notice racial differences. Why? Because race is a social construction primarily based on skin color. So babies begin to differentiate, oh, people have different shades of brown, ranging from really, 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 really light to really, 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 really dark. Lots of melanin in their skin, a little bit of melanin. And by age 4, kids begin to show racial bias. Now, I'm not making this up. There are studies about this, right? And because I'm a mother of 3 Black daughters, I can attest to this, right? They are now 12, 13, and 14. But we have been having race conversations since our 14-year-old was 2. Secondly, encourage your child to ask questions. Don't try to sweep race under the rug. Kids are actually curious about race. My 14-year-old is very fair-skinned and she has greenish gray eyes. My older sister is married to a white man. When my 14-year-old was 2, she wondered why her skin looked like Uncle Dwayne's and not the rest of ours. That began our conversations around race, right? And her understanding, what does it mean to be African American, even though your skin is really, really light? That was an opportunity to explain that African Americans come in lots of shades of brown, right? But Uncle Dwayne is not African American, he's white, and his skin color is really, really light. These conversations just need to be developmentally appropriate. Another thing, you want to expose kids to different racial and ethnic groups through literature, through critical media, through one-on-one small group interactions and large group interactions, right? Don't shelter them, let them, and don't rely only on school to do the work for you. As a parent or grandparent, you create those opportunities for them. Thirdly, be mindful. What we do is more often more important than what we say. Kids are always watching. When my daughter raised that question, I had to think very carefully about how to answer it. But I also know she watches, even from that young age, how we interact with Uncle Dwayne, who does not look like all the brown people in her family. So be careful about how you are modeling healthy cross-cultural relationships. How diverse is your friendship circle? What types of choices are you making to provide culturally diverse experiences for your grandchildren if their worldview is racially or ethnically homogenous, right? If they go to a predominantly one race school, what are the opportunities they have to interact with kids from other racial groups? As parents, I believe it's on us and grandparents to create those opportunities when they don't exist. Number 4, know and work on your own biases. Because we are socialized in a society where racism exists, we develop biases, y'all. And we have to be honest with our children and grandchildren about what our biases are, racial or otherwise, and then share with them your own experience trying to overcome those. See, then you begin to model for them how to think through their own biases, because they have them even if they don't realize they do. That's called implicit bias. Know and love who you are. Talk about the histories and experiences of various groups that you and your family identify with. That's why I gave you the example of we're a Black family, but we have people from other racial ethnic groups in our family. My children have a third cousin who's Puerto Rican and Black. Right? So they have a cousin who married into the family who's Puerto Rican, and my biological cousin who's Black, and they have a child. We talk about how he identifies and also what it means in society that he is Black presenting. He looks Black, and so people treat him as if that is his identity. Talk about these different multiracial and biracial combinations in your own family. And talk about histories. Tell stories about the challenges your family has faced and overcome as it relates to race. We all have somebody in our family who still uses racist labels, who is a bigot, who is discriminatory. And our kids don't need to be sheltered from that, because they're going to encounter similar people in their everyday life and the world. And then develop racial literacy. That's connected to one of the points I made on the other slide. Your racial literacy is your awareness of various racial groups across the country or across the globe, really. And so study and talk about the histories and experiences of groups that we call, right? That's that social construction. Black or African American, Latinos, Latinx, Asian Americans, Native Americans or Indigenous people, and whites or Caucasians. Some people use the term Caucasian. Be sure that your child understands that every racial ethnic group includes people who have different positions and attitudes, even within the group. Another book here is by Jelani Memory. I put for you, you can order this one, a kid's book about racism. Again, it's geared for kids and it's a nice read along for you and your grandchild or your own kids. So these are a couple of tips I wanted to give you. If I were giving this webinar to a group of teachers, I would use these same 6 tips. Why would I do that? Because they teach young people from pre-K to 12th grade. And these same tips are important for teachers. The other thing I'd say is many teachers are already doing this work, and it's not critical race theory. This is just anti-racist teaching, and it's just good teaching, right? But it's being framed as CRT in the public discourse. I've put my references here for you from where I gleaned this information. I feel responsible to do that because I didn't make these things up out of my head. And I'm sure your organizers can provide you these links after the session. And now I'm ready for the Q&A. Thank you so much for listening. I'll stop the screen share.
Thank you, Dr. Carter Andrews. I want to encourage everyone to put your questions in the Q&A. And again, two of our education committee members, Judy Andre and Betty Minchick, will be fielding those questions and get them to me and or to Dr. Carter Andrews. Meanwhile, I have a question. You know, you said that this critical race theory has been around for 20, 30 years. And of course, now it's popped up in the current atmosphere. But during that time, have you seen much of a difference in how teachers are prepared to deal with equity and inclusion?
That's a great question, Pat. And again, it's been around for almost 30 years in education. The theory itself has been around since the 70s. So that's more like going on almost 50 years. Mm-hmm. I would say that more and more, you know, I'm chair of the Department of Teacher Education. So let's say a high school student is going to college to be a teacher. Many teacher preparation programs, I would probably say the majority, are not teaching critical race theory. Like future teachers don't get a course in the theory. It is primarily taught to graduate students, master's and PhD students. But what future teachers do get is, in many of their programs, not all, is some training around social justice teaching. And that's going to include looking at racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, linguicism, all the isms, right? Now, what you find are professors like me who know the theory and people who do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. We are finding that over, you know, the last 30 years that this work has been in education, people have been doing professional development in schools. And so some practicing teachers have learned about CRT. Now, they don't then go and teach CRT in their classroom, but it does make them rethink, ooh, how am I talking about race or not talking about it with my students? Mm-hmm. How can I do better, right? So their learning about the theory then helps them reshape their practice.
Thank you. Betty, Judy, do we have another question? You can.
We have a number of questions about SB 460. What has been the reaction to that, and where is it in the legislative process right now?
Ooh, these are great questions. The reaction has been, I mean, you know, it's polarizing. Some of you may be familiar with the school board, these contentious school boards that have happened in school board meetings that have happened across the state of Michigan. Grand Ledge was in the news. They hired me as a consultant. There was a lot of pushback to the school board for hiring me. And then people were saying CRT is going to get taught in Grand Ledge schools. You have other communities in Michigan where school boards have had just all out, you know, there have been safety issues with the way parents have come to the mic and made threats and so forth. So I think it's because parents are subscribing to those myths, and they actually, that's why I wanted to share with you all the myths and inaccuracies about the theory and the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion that school districts are actually doing. Now, I will say teachers are very nervous about SB 40. If it passes, that they're going to be nervous to even talk about race in the ways they've been talking about it in schools. And sadly, to me, that is a disservice to our young people.
Thank you. Judy.
Okay. Yeah. Dr. Carter Andrews, can you say anything, give any particular example of what has been changed in the curriculum as people become aware of how deep a problem racism is?
Yes, that's great, Judy. Did I cut you off? There's a little bit of a lag.
No.
Okay, good.
No.
So we can easily talk about teaching kids about slavery, right? Listen, I always get nervous as we approach February. I mean, you're gonna see it. So even before the CRT discussion, teachers were just incorrectly teaching slavery in our schools. Some teachers give assignments like, what were the benefits of slavery? I mean, CRT would tell you there are no benefits to the people that were enslaved, right? Why would you ask young people to think about the benefits that enslaved Africans received? But there are teachers, social studies teachers, elementary age teachers who give those types of assignments. I want you all to watch the news next month. It never fails. Teachers make the news about the racist assignments they give in school. So to Judy's question, many teachers have been educated around the ideas of the theory, as well as what it means to teach in culturally responsive ways, and they've changed the ways in which they teach slavery. How do we teach slavery as a system of institutional racism, right? And then how do we share the narratives of resistance of enslaved Africans? So young people don't just learn about them as like, woe is me, those enslaved Africans, but there are historical accounts about resistance to the system, right? Or the ways in which enslaved Africans held on to aspects of their culture. We don't teach that. But Judy, when teachers are exposed to critical race theory, they rethink and say, man, how do I also teach slavery from the voices of the enslaved Africans?
So one grandmother would like to know, what kind of experiences would we do with our children and grandchildren so that they would have more interactions with a diverse group of people?
That's a great question. We're privileged. I don't know how wide this group is. I'm thinking Greater Lansing, but we are really privileged to live in a college town. There are so many, stay abreast of the various events that come to the Wharton Center, that come to MSU and the city. Take your grandkids to various cultural events. Take them to the Charles H. Wright African American Museum in Detroit, even if they're not African American, right? Like that's part of the learning. There are so many cultural resources here in the Greater Lansing area, and there are events that come that are often free, right? If you are looking for, and your son or daughter or child is willing and working with you around raising consciousness for the kids, you all think together about what are activities, extracurriculars that they can be in where they're regularly involved with kids from culturally diverse groups, right? And again, I think living in a college town gives us a lot of opportunity.
think,
Great suggestions.
Thank you. I think our time is running a little bit short. I want to ask one more question. I think it'll probably be a short answer. But is there a way to teach about equity, inclusion in the schools that will have all of the children, regardless of their ethnic background, feel more comfortable?
No. No. And I'll tell you why, because any discussion about these topics includes the positives and the negatives, right? You can't have privilege without disadvantage. I mean, it's like a seesaw. And so you can't talk about race, class, gender. I mean, you could, but then you're sugarcoating. You can't take an equity lens and not talk about disadvantage. And so the privileged people or kids are gonna maybe feel a little guilty, and those who identify with the disadvantaged group are gonna feel sometimes embarrassed. That's why it helps when you follow up. Like, no, honey, there's nothing wrong with you. These things do happen, but how can we resist those things?
So we train our children to deal with those things.
To deal with them
rather than hiding.
Yes.
Facts, to like respond to facts in a way that they can include it in their overall knowledge.
In their own knowledge. And you know what, y'all, that's a conflict resolution skill. And that is a 21st century skill that they need in the labor market. Betty has her hand there. I don't know if we have time.
I wondered about curriculum materials of the 1619 curriculum, which fits in so many ways into particularly the high school curriculum. How are teachers being trained to use the curriculum materials that are out there and to be able to think about including or learning about, considering that most of the labor force in Michigan is white and probably came from at least a middle class background, and that how do we ensure that our kids are going to get the kind of education that you are proposing for them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I can answer it quickly, Betty. So just so you all have some knowledge of this, school curriculum, what is taught in schools is in part determined by the school board. They have to vote, right? In many of our districts, they are the decision makers, right? And so for the school district. So in districts where you find there is equity and justice curriculum, the school board has been supportive of that. I think in many places, as long as your superintendent, your school board, your building principal are saying, thumbs up, let's do this, then they move forward with identifying curriculum that teaches kids about these issues in critical ways. There are districts where they're saying absolutely not. And so even if teachers have a commitment to do the work, now they're up against the decision makers in their district. And that, Betty, is a little tougher. I think what we'll find moving forward is districts and school boards who are supportive, the teachers will just keep doing what they've been doing and do it better. And districts where there's not support, teachers will feel suppressed, or they'll leave the profession or try to find another district. And either of those options is just not ideal.
Thank you, Dr. Carter Andrews. My understanding has certainly been deepened, and I hope that all of our participants have learned something or have felt enriched by our discussion today. And I'm going to turn this over to our president, Donna Mullins.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter Andrews. This is such a deep and complicated issue. It has to do with how we relate to each other, which,
Yeah.
you know, a theory doesn't do it, okay? You know, it's a framework to look at the way we relate to each other. Last June was my grandson's 4th birthday, and they had a birthday party and invited all the folks from the child care center that he goes to and their neighbors and their friends. And I looked around, and there were every group. Okay, I mean there were all the so-called races. Okay, every color of them. There were kids with very serious disabilities. Okay. There were different kind of marriages. There were all kinds of things. And I thought, wow, this is a different world than the world I was raised in. Yeah. And he is not looking at them the way I was. I was saying, how great this is diverse. And he was not thinking anything. This to him was life. And so it seems to me that, I mean, that's getting us closer to the
impossible. It does. It does, Donna.
And also looking at things from a different framework and seeing what reality does get us closer. All of those things are there to the dreams that Martin Luther King spoke about, where we look at people based on their merits, not on how they look. He didn't add because it wasn't a thing then, or how they love.
No.
It's based on their merits. So every step that we take is closer, and I'm really glad for you giving us a new way to understand this. It's terrifically important. And then I'm going to contact you later on, and I'm going to beg you to become a member of our organization.
Oh,
well,
thank you.
So thank you very much, and thanks very much to the Education Committee for putting this together. When we learn about the issues that are important to voting, that's why people vote. We have people from our Observer Corps looking at observing local boards of education so that we can learn about more what they're doing. And that, though, we vote for them in the off years. So something that's incredibly critical doesn't be done. So everything we do can be affected by our awareness of what's going on in local government, as well as the larger kinds of forms of government, and also by pointing out that the way to change things is by voting. You know, maybe you can't fight City Hall, but you can put the people in City Hall who you agree with. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. And oh, by the way, if you haven't renewed your membership, get on it. Thank you very much. Have a great new year.